Welcome everybody to this afternoon's Gehman lecture. I'm Andrew Nelson. I'm the chair of the Department of Anthropology here at Western University. Just a note, as Andrew Walsh has put in the chat, this session is being recorded. So if you do not wish your face to be recorded, you can turn off your video. Zoom. After 18, 20 months, whatever it is, Zoom is pretty tiring, but it does actually facilitate this kind of event quite nicely. Anne is joining us from Trent. I see Karen is joining us from Toronto. Hi, Karen. And I'm sure we've got people from, well, we certainly have people from across campus, I see. So that's all good. So and welcome, of course, to Anne Gehman, who is here representing the Gehman family. So that's very great to have you here. So I'm going to keep my intro brief. I'll get out of your way. I'm just going to let you know that we have a sequence of sort of preliminary things here. We've got a land acknowledgement, which is going to be given by Lauren Poeta. Dan Jorgensen is going to talk a little bit about John Gehman and the Gehman lecture. And then Andrew Walsh is going to actually introduce Anne Meneley, and then we'll actually get to Anne. And then once Anne has finished her talk, then Kim Clark is going to handle the question period. So I look forward to all of this. So with that, I'll get out of the way. So Lauren, you're up.
Bonjour, Ani Lauren Dijnakas, Waba Bagakwe Digo, Wikwam Kong Donjiba. Hello, my name is Lauren, and my spirit name is Changing Leaves Woman. My family is from Wikwemkong unceded territory, and I was raised on Curve Lake First Nation, both communities of the Anishinaabeg. I volunteered to give the land acknowledgement for this event to remind everyone that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Pewak, and Chinonton peoples, on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum. We must respect and support the long-standing relationships that each Indigenous nation has to this land, as they are the original caretakers and rightful stewards of the land that we are occupying. Since this event is online, and I know several members of our department community are located outside of London, we must also acknowledge the entire history of Turtle Island and not just the Indigenous territories that Western is geographically occupying. There are more than 50 sovereign Indigenous nations with their own unique life ways that were disrupted and demonized by the colonization of our land. Western institutions have contributed to and benefited from the denial and oppression of Indigenous and human rights of the people of each of these nations. The Indigenous population is now the youngest and fastest growing demographic in Canada. We cannot continue this path of mistreatment and injustice. We are still here and we have a growing voice. Although the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation has just passed, it is a luxury only to be feeling the burden of our state's history in recent times. While the practice of reconciliation and decolonization will look different for everybody, as a settler on this stolen land, you have a duty to support the resilient efforts and success of Indigenous people. As anthropologists and as academics, we are uniquely situated to help make Canada as loving and supportive as Turtle Island has always been to us. Thank you, and Chimigwech.
Thanks very much, Lauren. So Dan Jorgensen, Emeritus Professor in Department of Anthropology, will now give us a little background into John Gehman and the Gehman Lecture.
I think I want to start out by saying that for years, John was my closest friend in the department. He's the first person I met when I came out to visit folks here way back in the dark ages. He was one of the founding members of the Department of Anthropology. And he was a sociocultural anthropologist who taught undergraduate courses here at Western for almost 4 decades. His specialty was Caribbean ethnography, but he was a generalist at heart. And he once described himself as the department's utility infielder, having at one time or another taught nearly every course and every student in the department. And that's actually not an exaggeration. He was originally trained as a historian, and he took special pains to situate anthropology and its ideas in historical and philosophical context. He often crafted short bibliographical essays for his classes, and these are real gems. And these included a series called Cases of Mere Semantics, about words and how they get used and what that means in terms of social life, and notable Victorian opinions, some of which would be relevant to Lauren's discussion earlier. And this was a way of leading students into an appreciation of the discipline's relevance to wider intellectual and political currents. He was demanding, but his combination of erudition and a disarming sense of humor helped students to see that they were capable of far more than they realized when they first walked into his classroom. Not surprisingly, a number of John's students went on to become anthropologists. A gifted teacher and a generous colleague, John was an intellectual who wore his learning lightly. His humor, knowledge of just about everything, and his broad view of life were a joy to all who knew him. This lecture series is named to honor his memory, and today's lecture seems especially fitting. As a Caribbeanist, John was concerned with anthropology's relation to resistance and hope, a theme he returned to often in his teaching.
Thanks very much, Dan. So Andrew, would you like to introduce our speaker for today?
It would be my pleasure. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Anne Meneley, Dr. Anne Meneley, who's a professor in the anthropology department at Trent University and completed her PhD at NYU in 1993. And her doctoral research was subsequently published in a book that, if you haven't yet read it, I encourage you all to read. It's a classic, Tournaments of Value, Sociability and Hierarchy in a Yemeni Town. And I can confirm it's a classic because it's been republished, which doesn't happen that often, in a second edition just a few years ago by University of Toronto Press. Anne has, of course, worked on many projects over the past 25 years. Looking over her CV, I realized, oh my gosh, there are even some in here I didn't even know about, which is quite amazing, given that I've followed Anne's career over the years. And this has involved research in Yemen, Italy, California, New York, and most recently, and most often, I should say, in recent years in Palestine. She has published and presented her findings widely, encouraging readers and audiences to engage in critical reflection on what's too often taken for granted. I think something that we often aspire to do in anthropology. So critical reflection on everything from the competitive side of sociality to the culture and power dynamics of academia in a great book I would recommend to many of you, and I know I've had some students anyways read. And now I was surprised to learn, but not so surprised that it's so interesting, the quantification and gamification of walking, something that I think a lot of us have developed an interest in maybe in recent years. And of course, something that touches on what she will be talking about today, the production, consumption, circulation, and meaning of olive oil and other plants and commodities. So without further ado, I will just welcome Anne and thank her on behalf of the department and also of especially the students in social sciences who have helped to support this talk to the department, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm honored by the invitation to deliver this year's Gehman lecture and am delighted to see so many familiar faces. Before I take us to the world of plants in Palestine, I'll begin with a few reflections on my own gardening work, which was inspired by COVID lockdowns. I'm now convinced I like plants more than people, which I appreciate is hardly something an anthropologist should confess. It was with some relief that I realized there was a possibility of planthropology, a term coined by Casper Brun Jensen, a Danish anthropologist, in 2015. Jensen argues that science and technology studies have not paid enough attention to the plant world. Similarly, John Hartigan argues that while the human-non-human relationship has been celebrated in recent scholarship, it is the non-human animal that anthropologists seem more inclined to embrace, leaving plants out of the species term. In a 2019 article, he suggests that we can do better and, in effect, can do plant anthropology. After a few reflections on plants and art, I am organizing our session today around my conversations with three key actors in the Palestinian food world. Mirna Bamia, a chef, artist, and forager. Fadi Katan, a Palestinian chef and food ambassador. And Vivian Sansour, an artist and seed activist. These are not pseudonyms. Rather, these public figures are actively striving to bring Palestinian plants and foods prepared from them to a global audience. So, openings between Palestine and Toronto. In the spring of 2020, we were not supposed to leave the city of Toronto, never mind the country. So I began, like many, to COVID garden. My neglect of gardening at home had been affected by my gardening research elsewhere. For the past several years, I have, as soon as our semester ends in the first week of April, I get on a plane to conduct research with Palestinian agro-activists who practice fertile resistance to the Israeli occupation. In this work, or in the spring, I work with seed savers, foragers, and organizers of farmers markets, which sell Palestinian produce instead of Israeli industrial agricultural products. To my surprise, during the COVID springs of 2020 and 2021, I found that my amateur greening attempts at home opened up some mental time and space to reflect on Palestine, where I have most often worked in actual fields as a volunteer olive picker and forager. In those contexts, I was very much the laborer who received instructions from olive farmers or expert foragers. At home, I was branching out alone, determined to overcome what Hartigan calls the pervasive plant blindness that characterizes modern urban-bound humans. I was and remain inspired by my Palestinian friends, radical plant activists before it became fashionable, striving for food justice beyond nutrition with their unparalleled energy and humor. Another practice Palestinians are very attentive to is land acknowledgement, having had the experience still ongoing of having their land confiscated in front of their eyes. So in our own settler colonial land, as I gardened, I acknowledged that the land I'm cultivating in my front yard is the land of the Mississauga of the Credit Nation First Nation. And I am sitting with gratitude on this land as we speak, although no longer in my front yard. As Hartigan notes, there are many difficulties in engaging plants as ethnographic subjects, including the fact that the vast majority of plant socializing is underground and inaccessible through traditional ethnographic techniques in the field. It was indeed the underground that provided the first problem or challenge for me. In the spring of 2020, after canceling a plane reservation to Palestine, I gazed with new eyes on our long neglected front yard. For years, we've made flippant quips about letting it go back to a natural state, read weeds. We needn't have made jokes about it because as passing real estate agents provided their own fodder, often ringing our doorbell over the years to inquire if we wanted to sell, since it seemed apparent to them that only an elderly person close to death's door would leave their yard in such a state, and we might be interested in selling. My COVID planting, I decided, needed some man labor. Our son, far bigger and stronger, nicely agreed to help, but deftly managed to make plans on gardening day. So I began digging in our front yard. 2 hours later, I had cleared a small patch from the weeds. Another 2 hours passed. Covered in dirt as I toiled, I began to think about Karl Marx's description of peasants as potatoes in a sack, and I did kind of feel like a sweaty potato. And I quickly discovered that doing research with gardeners about their practices was not the same as gardening myself. We do not have a large front yard, but after 8 hours, it seemed like a vast estate. The next day, I could hardly lift a pencil. Some gardeners have discovered special talents that they were unaware of before. But I felt at risk of earning a phrase from one of the worst letters of recommendation I have ever read. Enthusiastic, if not gifted. However, my new planting zeal was praised by my next door neighbor, a former elementary school teacher who gave me encouraging words as she might have offered to a 6-year-old. For years, our mangy front yard had stood in stark contrast to her own carefully cultivated yard. My improvement of our front garden had a notable effect. The same neighbor gleefully informed me that the word on the street was that our house had been sold. I did notice that front yard gardening is a polite opening to interact with complete strangers. On their way to walk their dogs in Hyde Park, many stop to offer either compliments or free advice. One little girl from the nearby Montessori school started calling me plant lady. Some brought me spare perennials from their yards, and I offered poppy buds in exchange. Some admired my planty transformations, although many laughed at my use of what my son calls, rolling his eyes, plant voice. A doting voice that people usually reserve for pets or babies. That's how I talk to them. My son did not seem impressed by my claim that I was, in Hartigan's words, using my plants as an opportunity to test the strictures of anthropocentrism. And my plant voice might not have been what Hartigan meant when he suggested that we treat plants as ethnographic subjects, but never mind. The decision in spring of 2020 to forbid in-person shopping at outdoor garden centers was one of the many Ford government decisions that caused an immediate outcry, followed by a swift reversal. As a garden center owner told me, their yearly income is mostly earned in the spring. Most customers, especially amateur gardeners like me, might not know the name of the plant we want, so online shopping doesn't work. And I suspect that many like me are also enthusiastic impulse buyers. The first summer, I didn't go beyond pots of chives, thyme, mint, rosemary, and sage. But this year I expanded to include edible nasturtiums and borage flowers. I added equally stylish bitter mustard greens and Sicilian eggplant with stripes, according to the label. My brother offered his wooden wine boxes as plant holders, which I thought evoked what food scholar Fabio Parasecoli calls a global Brooklyn aesthetic. Conversations with sellers in a pop-up farmer's market run out of a storefront of a former restaurant indicated how much had changed under the duress of COVID, with problems of movement, labor, and border restrictions. One vegetable farmer talked of making informal alliances to try to survive during COVID time. He transports the meat of lamb and pig farmers to the pop-up market. In exchange, these farmers lend him space in their barns to hold his fresh produce while he scrambles to find buyers. We complained about the initial closure of farmers markets while stores like Loblaws and Walmart were fully open. In many ways, I was reminded of my Palestinian farmers who've had to develop complex strategies and networks to address the effect of the Israeli occupation on their local food production. Okay, plants and art. As Rochelle Davis notes, for Palestinians, gathering wild or cultivated plants of their own land or villages is a ritual act. These products of the earth, orange and olive trees and cacti, are an essential visual vocabulary in the iconography of Palestinian art and literature. The recent book by Nora Lester Murad, Rest in My Shade, a poem about roots, is a poem voiced by an olive tree which narrates its connection to the Palestinian people, along with the effect of the occupation on both trees and people. Dedicated to refugees and displaced people everywhere, it features remarkable paintings and illustrations by Palestinian artists like Steve Sabella and Slimane Mansour, depicting both olive trees and their uprooting. The 2021 Toronto Palestinian Film Festival featured an online interview with artist Slimane Mansour, famed for his depiction of olive trees. He discussed a recent painting where there is no olive tree at all, just Palestinians on ladders with their arms raised as if they were picking olives from a tree no longer there. The painting shares the fear of disappearance, although whether it will be the people or the trees who are in greatest danger of being disappeared is another question. Artist Rana Beshara offers the book's final image of olives and their leaves, illustrating an image of the kufiyya, the scarf associated with Palestinian resistance and steadfastness. Beshara, in a recent interview with Laila Abalugud, described serving olive oil and the beloved herb za'atar to foreign audiences as a performance piece called Zait and Za'atar, so oil and za'atar, offering them a visceral and aesthetic experience of Palestine. Not only are plants featured in artwork is often displayed with them on the gentle terraces of the Palestinian Museum in Bir Zayt, which was finished in 2017. The gardens of the Palestinian Museum show the incredibly diverse plants of Palestine and their importance to trans-regional trade long before the era of the nation state. As our critic Hanan Toucan notes, the garden of the museum also invokes plant politics in the politics of displacement. And this is a quote from Toucan. The planting on the grounds of the museum of groves of apricot, pomegranate, mulberry, cypress, olive, walnut, and fig trees, lemons and oranges, herbs like za'atar, mint, and other plants that Israel has appropriated as part of a policy of erasing the memory and identity of Palestinian people are a step towards reclaiming what has been taken away. But standing inside the museum, looking out of the floor to ceiling windows that adorn an entire wall that overlooks the hills and the Mediterranean Sea in the distance that Palestinians of the West Bank are barred from reaching thanks to Israeli imposed restrictions on movement, the foundation on which Zionism stands is usurped, even mocked, if only momentarily. The politics of plants and their cultivation, harvesting, and foraging is as central to this museum as it was to the art collections there and to Myrna Bamia's dinner, which was hosted there. I now turn to the main sections of this talk. In the first of the three conversations with Palestinian food activists. So Myrna Bamia is the first, and here she's addressing the politics of foraging. On my spring visit to Palestine in 2018, I was taking part in a foraging walk where I found myself mystified by my Palestinian interlocutors' ability to see edible plants in what to me looked like a nice collection of nice looking greens, reminding me of what Hartigan asserted, that we have a difficult time noticing plants at all. And as a species as decor sensibility leads most of us to see them only as background wallflowers. Up until this point, my plant eyes had focused on olives. And over the years, I began to be quite good at spotting the elusive olives, even the ones that seem to be hiding until you're so tired you can hardly raise your arm to pick them. On my spring visit in 2019, I was delighted to hear that Myrna, the chef, artist, and forager, was hosting this dinner at the Palestinian Museum, which featured in 16 courses the wild plants of Palestine. I went with my friend Aisha, who I'd met while olive picking in 2007. And over the years, she had connected me with her networks of food and plant activists. Does your mouth tingle? Was the first question our chef Myrna asked us at the Wild Plants dinner on a sunny day in April. We had just been served a dish, loof, that to my eyes looked like Swiss chard. This was not a question I was expecting from a chef, and in fact, the dish looked so ordinary that Myrna's announcement that loof is so poisonous in its raw state that it can make one's throat close. This surprised me. This fact, delivered to the guests just after we had consumed our first bites, made the point of the dinner, the importance of local knowledges and the crafts of wild food production, very effectively, highlighting that Palestine is in the scientific name, Arum Palestinium. Myrna told the story of how our grandmothers knew how to change loof from a dangerous plant to a healthy dish by an overnight soaking with salt and slow cooking with plenty of olive oil. Here, the grandmother, Teta, stands for knowledge that risks generational loss, highlighting the urgency of its transmission. Myrna's voice was drowned out temporarily as laughter and conversation erupted. Two guests at our table gave funny descriptions of their botched loof cooking attempts, while Aisha said she'd given up trying because she didn't want to poison anyone. It tasted delicious, and while I felt a mild tingling, it didn't feel life-threatening. And the fact that everyone ate it with alacrity indicated that we all trusted Myrna's absorption of Teta's knowledge. Again, it was a very persuasive argument for the need to learn about the wild plants of Palestine from those who know how to transform a dangerous plant into a delicious, nutritious delight. And what it led us all to reflect on what it means to have this vitally important cultural knowledge in threat of being lost. And it was an urgent concern for Myrna. She said that as the land is taken from us, they are losing the knowledge of how to identify the plants, the names of the plants, their uses as food and medicine. And there is a general recognition of the fact that knowledge of the plants is not bred in the Palestinian bone, but is part of the Palestinian cultural heritage, like its architectural heritage and arts and crafts heritage that needs to be preserved. New eyes are essential for learning to identify the wild plants, like wild asparagus, which we were served, which Myrna described as a beautiful treasure, and the wild plant world as a treasure box that people now rue neglecting. In contrast to cultivated asparagus, wild asparagus sprouts up unpredictably. I told her how my interview with an olive farmer a few days earlier had been completely derailed by his spying a wild asparagus under an olive tree. And we spent the rest of the afternoon darting after these wild treasures as we talked. I finally and viscerally understood the mushroom foragers described by Anna Singh, who derive personal pleasure and community esteem for their skills at foraging in blasted landscapes. Like mushrooms, wild asparagus can be sold for a high price in the market, but it isn't a predictable crop, and foragers have varying skills. I learned, as did Myrna, about the importance of having a guide who teaches one how to see. These are practices that need to be transmitted as they underpin the possibilities for a food future imbued with the skills of the past. The rapid expansion of illegal Israeli settlements continues, threatening Palestinian olive groves, agricultural land, and lands where Palestinians have traditionally gathered these wild plants. The work of lawyer and anthropologist Iris Braverman has been very important in elucidating how the Israeli concept of nature and their idea of how to protect it has serious consequences for Palestinians. Braverman describes the strategic use of the Israeli planting of pine trees to obscure both the sites of Palestinian villages and compete with Palestinian olive groves and create nature reserves from which Palestinians are excluded. As artist Jumana Mana notes, Israeli laws have focused on prohibiting the foraging of za'atar, which is this wild thyme, and akub, which is a wild thistle, for environmental reasons, but it is more a means of curtailing Palestinian movement, as foraging is a process of selective gathering of the wild plants, not uprooting or eradicating them. She argues, negotiating the politics of plant extinction with an occupier is always complicated, especially in the context of Palestine, where over the past 70 years, Palestinians themselves have been treated as an invasive species in urgent need of elimination and control. The protection of one form of life, non-human life, has been used as an extra tool to suffocate a people who have survived attempts at cultural erasure and ethnic cleansing. The Israeli botanist Mana Consulted argued that the Israeli infrastructure and settlement project has destroyed far more plants than Palestinian foraging practices ever could. In her dinner, Bamia begins with the stories of how she learned about these foraging practices from elderly Palestinians who also shared their distinctive culinary uses of the wild plants. As Myrna notes, one's relationship to the land becomes abstract when the land is so difficult to access. She said that geography is not one you can know in an embodied way, and this changes yourself. Again, the artist Jumana Mana, who I just cited earlier, found herself quarantined at her parents' house in Shuafat, which is a Jerusalem suburb, during the pandemic. Because she was under quarantine, instead of making her film, she found time to walk and forage, reinforcing the point about foraging and belonging. And this is another quote from her. Throughout the quarantine, foraging became a hybrid performance of food sovereignty as well as culinary delight. It is for me an intimate practice that strengthened my sense of belonging and connection to the landscape. Okay, my second interlocutor is Fadi Katan, a chef, hotelier, and food ambassador. I'm not sure he'd agree with the food ambassador part, but I'll take it up with him next time I see him. I first met Fadi through Myrna when in Bethlehem I stay at his guest house, Hosh al-Syrian, which was restored for the Bethlehem municipality by the Italian government. This guest house, just 2 minutes away from the fresh food market of Bethlehem, houses his restaurant, Fauda. Fadi just gave a talk a few days ago for AFCARA, an association designed to reframe and reclaim narratives about the Arab world in a series called Matbach Online, so it's online kitchen. Fadi noted that he is still living in his family home, which was built originally in 1838, and showed us a photo of its garden featuring figs and lemon trees, arguing that planting is key to feeling in place, rooted in the land. Fadi is also very attached to his olive trees and announced that as far as his olive oil is concerned, he could just drink it all the time because it's so great. Here, Fadi is like every other olive producer I've met in Palestine, to Italy, to Greece. They all decide their own olive oil is the best. Olive trees do valuable work as in placers because they are long-lived, stalwart, and sessile. They stay still. As Hartigan notes, plants might be far more exquisite ciphers of place than the mammals examined by ethologists and ethnographers. Further, plants can actively constitute place because plants in the environment coexist productively, producing a distinct landscape, as the olive terraces of Palestine certainly do. And I've spilled a few words on that topic. Fadi's YouTube series, Tata's Kitchen, indexes what Myrna's does too, the need to record the traditions of the grandmother. And here the grandmother is sort of standing in for tradition in general. Fadi is very sensitive to regional variations in cooking depending on what local produce is available. He also mentioned how the occupation of the West Bank has changed the geography of produce and the geography of possibility. At one point, fish would be shipped from Gaza to Bethlehem. Now that Gaza is under virtual lockdown, trade in everyday food products has more or less stopped. While Fadi is one of the food figures who refuses to let Israeli narratives dominate, he noted that while Artas village, 4 kilometers southwest of Bethlehem, was famous for centuries for its produce, the Israeli settlement on the hill has now constricted the flow of water to these famed agricultural lands that go back to the time of Solomon. Well, much of the conversation, the last one I had with him, unfolded around questions about regional cuisines or differences in preparations of the same dish, depending on what part of Palestine one lives in. When asked about how his restaurant practice is related to this city, the place of Bethlehem, he said he would not exist as a chef without Nabil, who is the mother of Nabil, a long-standing figure in the food market, who sits in the same place every day with her collection of fresh produce, foraged or from her garden. He does not demand a certain product or quota of products from farmers or foragers, but is committed to creating dishes based on what they have to offer and what looks good. And here Fadi shows all of us his skill as a chef, since he's not recipe dependent as many of us are. And he aspires to use Palestinian fresh herbs, fruits, and vegetables to create his version of Palestinian gourmet cuisine. And he spent a lot of time in France, and so has, that also feeds into his cooking. And he shared a quote on Facebook recently expressing his longing to have his restaurant guests back. And this is a quote: "All the instances of magic, the pleasure of hearing the chatter reaching your ears from the dining room, the pride of sharing Palestinians' flavors Palestine's flavors with guests and friends, the moments when you share the story of the farmers, the artisans, the butchers, the producers who have made your cooking possible. You share these stories with your guests." One of the points that Fadi made in an interview with me in 2018 is that chefs have a wider audience, certainly wider than anthropologists, but who doesn't? But I think that is in some ways a very important point for the politics of communicating the situation they find themselves in. He also successfully managed to recruit Jamie Oliver to film a portion of Jamie's Ultimate Veg show in Bethlehem's food market. So the third Palestinian food expert I discuss here is Vivian Sansour, AKA the Seed Queen. And one of my gardening aspirations in COVID gardening was thinking that I might have a chance of impressing Vivian Sansour, who's the founder of the Palestinian Heirloom Seed Library, who works tirelessly to promote the preservation and dissemination of Palestinian seeds, which are drought resistant. Vivian was dubbed the Seed Queen in an Al Jazeera documentary, which is great. I wasn't delusional enough to think that Al Jazeera might want to make a documentary of the dreary anthropologist in her front yard. I don't go that far, but since 2017, I've participated in several of Vivian's planting workshops and given a guest talk on food anthropology at El Bir Arts and Seeds. Her seed library in Batir, a UNESCO sponsored heritage town famous for its agricultural terraces and irrigation canals. This village had been in danger of being eradicated by the wall that cuts into Palestinian territory, and it raised quite an outcry and was saved. And since the COVID, I think I don't know if I'm the only one who started doing online Zoom ethnography, but I have attended several of her online presentations about the importance of saving Palestine seeds. She is opposed to the idea of a seed bank, which she thinks sounds like a kind of sci-fi future where everything is, kind of dead or whatnot, but preferring the notion of a library to keep Palestinian agro culture alive through the little seeds, but also through sharing them and encouraging people to grow things from them. She finds power in the beauty of the seeds in the midst of the chaotic present that Palestinians find themselves in. The Baal seed varieties. Baal refers to the pre-Abrahamic Canaanite fertility deity, so these seed varietals include tomatoes, which can survive only on mountain dew, or morning dew, sorry, morning dew, and spinach and onion varietals, which will survive only with rain. And these drought and heat resistant varietals speak volumes to global discourse about climate change. But Vivian also describes the process of seed saving and sharing as preserving the genius of our ancestors. Every time I'm careless with water use, I remember a lengthy if charming rant by Vivian describing how irritating she found it when Americans would leave the tap running when brushing their teeth, indicating their complete ignorance of what water shortages might mean for farmers. And on the same visit, I heard how difficult it was when the Israeli water company restricted Palestinian water access so that cultivated land was parched, but also household water for cooking, washing, showering was also rationed. Charlotte Mendelson, a British novelist and avid gardener, asserts in an article in the New Yorker that seeds are the gateway drug to gardening, and Vivian's work has inspired many, including agro-activist Linda Kuvish. Hudson Valley Seeds now sells seeds for Palestinian Yakteen pumpkins. Vivian escorted the late Anthony Bourdain around Bethlehem and surrounding areas when he made his beloved Jerusalem episode of Parts Unknown. She was chosen to host Prince Charles when he planted an olive tree at the Carmelite Monastery in Bethlehem in January of 2020. And she confidently sent the prince home with packets of Baal seeds. In conclusion, in Saniat, the Society of Palestinian Anthropologists put out a call for papers for their biannual meeting entitled Hess Optimism, after the novel by Palestinian author Emil Habibi, which, and I quote, captures the inseparability of hope and despair that marks the Palestinian ethic of persisting in and against untenable conditions and the absurdities of being non-being. My contribution to this conference will be entitled Plant Optimism. While to some audiences, presenting Palestinian activities as hopeful might seem dewy-eyed, projects of harvesting, planting, seed saving, eco-farming, and foraging seem to provide some fertile grounds for projects of liberation or rights and their related solidarities and imagined futurities. I continue to be impressed with the hopefulness embedded in many acts of fertile resistance, which are generative for or imagining a future when one might be glad to have records of the past cultural, agricultural, and culinary expertise. I have found much inspiration for plants as teachers, and from these earthy activities I have witnessed and participated in Palestine. While my Sicilian eggplant produced promising blooms, it didn't produce any actual eggplants, so I do not plan to quit my day job and try to live off the land. But my admiration for those who can has increased tenfold. As a tool for anthropological methodology, I found my experiment in planthropology quite helpful for beginning to understand the extraordinary labor, shared knowledge, care, and genuine affection that can develop between humans and their plants. Over my years as a volunteer olive picker, I've seen Palestinians grieve when the settlers hack down or burn their olive trees. Olive trees are like kin. So these acts are processed emotionally as a form of murder. Their lands have been bulldozed for the enormous concrete separation wall, creating much more environmental damage than Palestinian agricultural activities could. This spring, as I gazed adoringly at my little plants, I was so pleased that they had begun to emerge again after a long winter. Many of my neighborhood plant friends were truly horror struck, as was I, when my other next door neighbor and his laborers began radical home renovations, digging up their front yard and covering half of my plant children in concrete dust. This experience has allowed me to make analogies to the more harrowing experience of Palestinian farmers who have seen their crops or olive trees they have cultivated with such a dedication destroyed for the establishment of highways or settlements in the West Bank. I have learned in a visceral way what it means to put efforts into plants and the land and to take joy in the plant progress. But more importantly, I've learned what it might feel like to have your land encroached upon and your plants destroyed after devoting so much love, worry, and sheer physical labor to them. Thank you.
Kim, you want to take over?
Sure. So while you're thinking of your questions, I'm just going to tell a little story about Anne. Anne and I both graduated with our PhDs in anthropology in 1993 in New York from two different universities. So I knew Anne from the time we were graduate students in New York. She was at NYU, I was at the New School, and we were kind of extended fictive kin because one of her besties from undergrad at McGill was one of my besties in grad school at the New School. So I remember the development of the ideas about her doctoral project. And then I remember the book prize celebration where her book was celebrated at the AAA. And we left there to go out and continue celebrating. And Anne saved me from a mugger. I don't know if you remember that, Anne.
Did I punch him?
No, you had your plant voice actually. And we were crossing the street in Washington, DC, and someone kind of, sort of grabbed my arm and sort of stuck something in my ribs and said, "Give me your purse." And I said, "I need my purse." And Anne said in the nicest, quietest plant-like voice, "Oh, please leave my friend alone." And he did. And then I said, you saw the gun, right? And she said, no. Anyway, we've had our adventures together. So that should give
By the
you.
way, that voice, I think, is from my mother. You know, it is very, it's quite, even though it sounds sweet, it's quite firm.
It was very firm. And I think that, yeah, the guy didn't really know what to do with that. So anyway, that gave you all time to think of your questions. So if you can put up your hand if you have something to say under the reactions little button at the bottom, then you'll pop to the top of the screen and I'll see that you would like to say something. Well, I will say I appreciated very much the connection to your COVID planting.
Oh, yeah.
And I had that same experience in many ways. I think many of us were involved in those adventures as we explored the confines of our own property lines. Fatima.
Yes, hello. I first want to thank you for your presentation. It made me a little bit nostalgic because I'm from Lebanon, and my grandmother lives in a small village, and I never thought of it of really foraging, but that's exactly what kind of I grew up with. You know, when I went for summer visits, and you just made me remember like things like the asparagus and those kinds of things. But my question is, what advice would you have to young anthropologists like myself, for example, in wanting to document that? You know, it's because it's been something on my mind, like how do we work in trying to document those things on a small scale from a distance with COVID and these kinds of things?
Well, yes. Well, I don't know if we should be surprised by this, but there have been an awful lot of these online kinds of presentations about these kinds of activities, which are, you know, I guess a port in a storm, because it's interesting to hear foragers talk about it on Zoom, but it is quite a bit different to learn how to identify the plants. For now, I don't know if I have much advice aside from do what you can to gather knowledge that doesn't require field work. So do the archival stuff, and you know, do all of that kind of background stuff, so that when you are able to go to the field, you have you know, you can really focus on the project at hand. But I found that particular kind of knowledge quite essential to having someone actually show you what to find. And again, I was astounded. And the first time I did it, I was with people who I didn't know personally, but they were friends with my olive kin. So as Kim pointed out, there's something like grad school kin, but there's also olive picking kin. And so, you know, it's really strange how I know people better who I pick olives with than some of the people in my department who I've known for 20 years, but we haven't sat under the tree. Anyway, my friend Aisha put me in touch with these guys who were going foraging. And so there I am, like just trusting, you know, eating these plants, which were quite delicious. But if I was on my own, I don't know if I would have even seen the value. And so that is one example of how this learning needs to be passed on. And I'm sure, Fatima, you probably learned how to identify the plants from your grandmother. You know visually what they look like and where you should break the stem and that sort of thing, so that you allow them to continue to flourish. You don't uproot them or destroy them in any way. That's,
Thank you.
well, I wish I could be more helpful, but may we soon be able to travel.
Yes, thank you.
Andrew Walsh.
Hi, thanks, Anne. That was really great. I'm wondering about, I know another interest you've had in the past is about the circulation, global circulations of various things, including olive oil. And I'm curious about seeds, especially. And I'm guessing Prince Charles was allowed to bring seeds home with him. But do you know of any, how that the restrictions on the global circulation of seeds, whether they're affecting people's efforts to, say, even create the kinds of seed libraries you mentioned earlier, or even just sort of ensuring some continuity around the world? Pam in the chat has asked about people in diaspora in the diaspora around the world, and how they are able to continue with some of these practices elsewhere. Is there a lot of smuggling going? It's like seed smuggling basically going on, and things like that?
Well, I assume that there probably is, except that people don't consider it smuggling. They probably have the same idea that my mother did, that if it's not drugs, it's not smuggling, so don't worry about it. But I think that, yes, you hear stories about it, of people who had absolutely no idea of that they were smuggling, just they're trying to take a piece of themselves home, especially if they're forcibly displaced. So movement is one thing when it's your choice, but when it's not, it's quite different. And so, and once, certainly for Zatar, people share it. Once it comes to the US, people will share bits with those interested. And there's a kind of Facebook group called Mama's Palestinian Kitchen, which is quite interesting, where people talk about how they got the plants over and who they're going to share it with or the like. That said, I mentioned that Vivian had, with Hudson Valley Seed Corporation. I don't exactly know how she managed that, but I imagine that it was legally done. And I don't know that part of how they establish. I think there are methods of checking the seeds to make sure they're not carrying some communicable disease or the like. And there is a big, or there was a big seed bank in Syria that had to move to Lebanon in the Bekaa Valley because of the violence there. Again, there's lots more to be done about it. And like most of my projects, it sort of happened by accident, In fact, the foraging thing came up when I was doing my project on walking, which is not over yet. And if you want to be an experimental subject, Andrew, just let me know about. Okay.
So I see a couple of comments with three now in the chat. So Pam is saying, my neighbors in Northwest London forage for grape leaves. Are there other examples of foraging in diaspora? So I'm not sure if that's a comment, a question for Anne, or a question for general discussion. Are you there, Pam? Well, do you have any comment on that, Anne?
I'm not sure that that's one of our options here in Canada, but in places where grape leaves do grow in the southern US, like my friend Aisha, who I mentioned, grew up, I think, in North Carolina, and they had grape leaves there. The rolled grape leaves are just exquisite. But I usually eat those when I'm in Palestine because I haven't, baby steps, I haven't quite developed my skills to go that far. And I also, anyway, another time I will tell you about my olive tree attempts, but that's a long story.
Pam, did you want to say something more about that?
No, I really feel like she answered my question when she answered Andrew's question. So it's totally fine. I'm sorry. It took me a while to figure out how to get my phone to unmute.
Okay.
Been there.
So now I see both Karen and Fatima with their hands up, maybe to respond to this. So you go ahead, Karen.
Well, I just had a different thing to say. It wasn't in relation to that.
Let me just ask if Fatima had something that was a follow-up to that.
Yeah, just a little follow-up. So there are grape leaves actually in the funniest of places sometimes, like on the side of the road. And I would, my mother-in-law or my dad be like, oh, look, those are grape leaves. And sometimes you would see people, not even knowing that they are grape leaves, and then going and asking like, oh, can we, come and pick these? Actually, my husband's uncle, they have some, and I've foraged those, and I've made my own stuffed grape leaves from those. So there definitely are grape leaves in Canada.
Really?
Foraging.
Oh.
Yeah, and there's also things like mulberries, which I think some people think are poisonous here or don't actually eat, but that's the main, they're called toot in Arabic. So those are completely edible. They come in black and also white. Also simple things like roses. Roses are edible, and they're used as a spice, as a flavoring in a lot of Middle Eastern or Levantine cooking. So there are, like, even just from my own experiences, there are some examples of foraging in the diaspora. And again, I never thought of it as foraging. So thank you for kind of pointing to that. But there are examples of that here.
Just if anyone's interested, Hyde Park is a very good spot for mulberry production. There's so many of them that are just left on the sidewalk. And so it seems like quite a shame. Although, again, the question of private property here is one where, would you, the streets are covered in the mulberry. So I'm sure that the owner of the mulberry is not harvesting themselves, but yeah, the opportunity is certainly there. It's just that we don't have that kind of view of the world in quite the same way, of the possibilities that are there, or and if you don't know, and this I think points to the problem, if you don't know what to do with the plants, then they're wasted in some sense. And so that's, I think, the real concern that my interlocutors had about the knowledge going away.
Karen, do you want to go ahead now?
Okay, thank you. So right now I'm reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Are you familiar with that?
Well, I have a copy of it, but I have not yet read it. So that's a completely different thing. So yes, I am interested and looking forward to reading it. Yeah.
Yeah, I see so many parallels in what you've just described and what I'm reading there. And my question was, because so in there she's talking about the honorable harvest, this kind of idea through various kinds of First Nations or Indigenous perspectives on plants, and thinking of plants as people, treating them as people that can be our teachers, that they have been around in the world a lot longer than human beings. So I wonder about parallels with that type of thinking with the Palestinians, or just whether they talk about the harvesting practices in a more general sense, things like you mentioned where to break the stem, but things like only not taking it all, don't take more than half, or don't take the first plant you see, don't take the last plant because you don't know, these kinds of ideas as part of not just the local knowledge about the plant ways, but that relationship with the plants, between the humans and plants.
Yes, I find that really quite fascinating. And the work of early ethnographer and medical doctor Tawfiq Kanan in Palestine, he was traveling around, under the British mandate, doing medical activities, but also collecting stories about, so he was a kind of amateur ethnographer, and all of his stuff about the olive tree being kin, and how you use the olive oil as a way of connecting to the saints, and that kind of sacrality of the human plant connection. And it wasn't like that there was a distance between I will exploit you, but rather it was an exchange. And this is particularly strong in olive trees, where I've done a lot of work on it, but it's like you feed the tree and the tree feeds you.
Right.
And so that there's that very close connection. But yes, the idea that you should not just completely devastate the plants while foraging, and do it in such a way that you will they will continue to be generative is really, really important. Some of the more modern, if you will, olive producers, when I asked them about, do you think the olive tree is kin? They were like, oh, that's old, the old fashioned. But I think there's a lot of people who really do feel that sense of connection, and responsibility.
Right.
That
That's what I was thinking. And the other side of that is that the human interaction with the plant can be beneficial or even necessary. Like for the plant survival, I think kind of goes against the intuition that some of us might have living in urban environments, that humans are only destructive. but actually, like planting and weeding and thinning out and doing things to the plant or with the plant can actually work in helping it propagate or continue on.
Right, and so it's like a co-thriving that depends on connection. Yeah, I think that's very true, and I think that there's for many reasons there has been recent kind of back and forth between Palestinian thinkers and indigenous North American thinkers too, in the plant world, but also in more political sense. What happens in a settler colonial environment.
Exactly, that's what I was thinking. Anyway, thank you.
I think Adriana has something. It looked like the clap gesture instead of the hand up, but I think she wanted to say something.
Sorry, yes, I did. And I thought I kept raising my hand and somebody kept taking it down. So thank you for the talk. I, as someone who's worked with gardeners for a long time, I can relate to a lot of what you discussed. I remember talking to this urban gardener in Toronto, and like you with your vegetable garden during the pandemic, he talked to me about how he had gained an appreciation for farmers and had even started reading newspaper articles about the plight of farmers. So for him, that gardening experience had activated all sorts of connections that went well beyond his success or not in this particular garden plot. But I did have a question. I was trying to take my time to sort of organize my ideas, and I'm not sure if I have managed to do that. But I guess I kept thinking about the examples that you chose. I mean, you talked about an artist, a chef, and I was trying to align your sort of, I think you used the words, fertile grounds for projects of liberation, and what to me sound like characters who are really plugged into the sort of global alternative food networks, which I guess I kept trying to think about how the efforts that these people are engaging in really connect with the struggles that are going on, more on the ground in terms of the Palestinian cause. I guess for me, you probably have all those connections, but for me, it wasn't clear. So I kept trying to imagine how this particular struggles are connecting with the struggle to recuperate the land.
Well, I think that you have a lot of global discourses coming in about climate change, about the problem with industrial agriculture, with chemical fertilizers, with the kind of dependence on seeds that don't reproduce themselves, the corporate influence, movements like community shared agriculture initiatives, eco-farming. All of these have kind of a global, are ideas which have a global circulation, and the people that I'm discussing today are very sophisticated in terms of those discourses, and they're very good at reaching wider audiences, certainly than anthropologists are. But the connection, they're always trying to make the connection to what they face on the ground that is specific, and what their challenges are that are different, and using a kind of universal, hey, we all need to eat. Yes, we are all, concerned about climate change, or at least many people are. So they use that kind of way of getting people's attention, but then the specifics of what it means to have these competing ideas of nature, and what does it mean that certain people are excluded from the nature areas, and when are you concerned about nature? Are you concerned about nature when it's Palestinian foraging, or are you concerned about nature when you're building a bypass road that will facilitate the settlers' easy access to Tel Aviv? So highways, maybe someone wants to mention this to Doug Ford, are also fairly environmentally destructive, as much as they are necessary. So there's, anyway, they're trying to work with the very specifics, problems that they face, along with these kinds of wider problems that everyone faces. Again, they inspire my admiration because of the energy that it takes, and there's not really any good reason to be optimistic, but I think there is something optimistic about the whole seeds, plants, growing, potential, sharing, and trying to stop the loss. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to ask Andrew to take over the Q&A management. I have to hop over to another meeting. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening right now in our chat, in case any of that should be pulled into the discussion. Thank you so much, Anne, and hope to see you again on Zoom or in person.
Yeah, and thanks for reminding me of that story. And I want to tell you some more stories next time we get together.
Perfect.
Okay.
Well, hopefully, Anne, you've got some stories about Kim.
Oh, now you can tell them I'm leaving.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. Now it's time for stories.
So, yeah, we've had this parallel discussion going on in the chat here about all kinds of different things. And I have to say, as you were talking, I did keep thinking about Kelly Linton's PhD thesis, which was just recently defended here or last year about agriculture in southern Ontario, southwestern Ontario. Was great. I don't know if anyone who's been commenting in the chat wants to bring anything up.
Well, I'm not very good at reading chat.
Oh no, that's okay. No, you don't have to. I think if we, Dan, did you want to? I saw your hand there.
I just unmuted myself. This is more by way of a response and a reaction. I'd love to talk, and it's got lots of radiating lines going out. And what struck me about it is something that's a kind of byword for people around here, and it resonates with folks that I knew in the field. And anybody who gardens has a stake in the future, and and the fact that they're gardening is making that stake real. They're enacting it, and that kind of thing. And your despair at seeing the stuff in your garden at home being trashed by neighbors' operations and stuff like that. I just saw some big trees come down in my neighborhood in a similar kind of thing. It's wrenching, and this is even if our livelihood doesn't depend on it. It's just, it does something to our world. The folks that I worked with in Papua New Guinea, they were, people sometimes talk about them as hunters, foragers. They know their way around the forest. They're really great at hunting, but in fact, they're black belt gardeners, and they're farmers more than anything else. And the identification between them and their plants is very, very literal. Children are equipped with planting stock of both sexes, with planting stock at around 6-7 years of age. And that's so that they can generate enough planting stock to found their own household when they marry. And they bring that along. People keep genealogies. They don't plant by seed, they plant by cuttings, root crops. So people keep track of the genealogies of their plants, and they can recognize different varieties and track them to different people and to different locations and different origins. And they see that it's part of their job to pass those things on. So there's also a sense of history as well as a commitment to the future there. There is a general sense that domestic plants, or at least garden plants, are living beings, and they're very much like your children. They're also very much like your parents, and you have to respect them. And if you don't do that, you deserve what you get. So that's the end of that particular comment, but I thought it was worth sharing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I think there's much to be gained from doing a kind of comparative study of it, but I don't think it's probably all that unusual to feel that the world that feeds you deserves some respect. And Andrew, I'm hoping that you'll just copy the chat for me and send it to me. That would be lovely.
Yeah, I've just mentioned that I will make sure you get a copy of the transcript of it, so that if anyone has recommendations, just post them in the chat and we can make sure. I was thinking about a paper that came out in the summer, your sort of reflections on hope and what are we doing and how can we write about these things. I would say it's a paper written by Sarah Osterhout, and it's called Bright Spot Ethnography, and it's actually it's very interesting. I'll send you the link. It's
oh, perfect. Thank you.
It's I think you might find it interesting.
I'm wondering if I may add a comment.
Of course. Now this is great because we've had John's colleagues here, and we've got a former student of John's here.
Yeah. Hi, Dan. It's Hamoudi.
How you doing? I thought so.
Hi, Ann. I don't know if I can't see you, but I can see you there, and it's just a pleasure to do this. But I really enjoyed this talk, and I wanted to say something that really echoed in your talk, which for me, as a person from the Middle East, is very important. And this is a topic that has been, and Andrew, I think, may know this, is top of mind for me because I'm a huge supporter of the Palestinian cause, and particularly on the ground, and particularly also in Lebanon. the concerns we have for the Lebanese and the Syrians and the Palestinians are very similar now. But what you said is something that I think it was a discussion I had actually with the Green Party recently, which is without social and political justice, where people can survive, they just demonstrate their resilience by things like gardening, cooking, maintaining a footprint on the ground. Because without safety, security, peace, the environment means nothing. We can sacrifice environmental causes, and we can lose people too. But for the environment to have real meaning to us as human beings, it probably means a lot more to other species who we're losing them by the minute, including plants. This talk echoed when you talked about the person who you knew, the people you met in Palestine, who took you around and showed you. And I walked there that way, and I walked that with our indigenous community here and gone to places. Unless you go see the places, it's just a story. Until you get your boots on the ground and dirty and talk to people who are actually gardening and getting their hands dirty. And I will just tell you this. Somebody asked, I put a chat about Tom and Ron Benner, both great artists, siblings. Ron's a year younger than Tom. And Ron has the Wolf Water Garden at Museum London, and he has archived indigenous plants native to the Americas in that water garden. So if you go behind Museum London, you could see it. It's difficult to get there now because of all the construction that's going on there, but it is there. And it's been there, I think, going on almost 20 years. And Ron is now the artist in residence. Interestingly, at the School of Agriculture in Guelph, instead of the School of Art, the School of Agriculture, a school he dropped out of as a student in university because they were sponsored by Monsanto. And he was deeply offended by the Monsanto project to create terminal seeds for farmers. So farmers are compelled to go buy seeds every year. And then they sell the products to the feed mill who sells them the seeds. It's, and in the Middle East, it's much tougher to find good seed. Anyway, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much. Andrew brought it to my attention yesterday, and so it's a great way to spend my hour of lunch. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that.
And John was everything Dan said about him and more. He was just the nicest, most kind, careful academic that, and there were many of them there. There was a class of about 14, I think, in the honors anthropology program. I took anthropology in a different direction and became a lawyer. So, thank you.
Well, that's nice to hear, and thank you for asking me to give the lecture.
So I think maybe we have just one more question, it looks like, from Elaine, and then.
Should I go?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if this at all speaks to maybe Adriana's question / comment as well. But just thinking and wondering whether this is actually true for many expelled populations in the idea that the people that are expelled from the different places, they're often the people that have this knowledge in particular, right? Because, for example, in Al-Andalus, when the Muslims were expelled, the majority of Muslims that were actually allowed to stay and to some extent, at least for a while, keep their religion were actually the people with agricultural knowledge. And so even up until the 1960s, 1970s, a lot of the agricultural terms, the etymology for the agricultural terms came directly from Arabic, not from Spanish, or it was a mix of the Romance language with the Arabic. And so because they're the ones, for example, the Christians couldn't actually make the majority of the agricultural, for example, what are called the acequias or the canals, and the way the water worked and the way the agricultural different irrigation and things like that. So I think I don't know if Anne could maybe comment on this if she has anything to say, just this idea of like this being perhaps the last, not necessarily the last, but definitely a very important bastion for knowledge in terms of claims to land and in terms of really establishing the fact that they are the indigenous people of the land.
Okay, well, there's a couple of questions there. I think first I wanted to talk a little bit about irrigation, if only to tell you that I don't know enough about it, but certainly in Batir, where Vivian Sansour has her seed library, they have a very elaborate system of irrigation, which is shared amongst sort of the 8 families in Batir. Also, where I worked in Yemen, the sort of not only the knowledge, but the rights of who has rights to access the water, who has the obligation to maintain the irrigation canal. All of that was recorded, and they were legal documents. And I think that in terms of having a kind of an ancient tradition of sharing and directing and collecting the water was extremely important to the kind of production of these heritage lands, and also the seeds that end up producing these beloved plants. Yes, and again, I think that in some ways, what people are talking about is the land, and that it is part of a wider kind of project of trying to establish their right to their land, where they're and the plants stand, especially the long living ones like olive trees, stand as a testimony to the fact that the land wasn't bare, that it wasn't a desert. Terraces do not build themselves. And I have to say that having, done my time on terraces, they're not, they're very hard. It involves a lot of hard labor, and also someone who knows what they're doing to imagine how you build the terraces on the side of the mountain and provide access for the water. It's very impressive and valuable knowledge. And so, but in some ways, I think that what these particular activists are trying to do is find a language to communicate their message that is effective, evocative, and productive, because they're trying to retain what their ancestors have given them and what they associate with love.
Well, that's maybe a very hopeful and positive way to end this. I'm conscious of the time, and I want to thank you, Anne, on behalf of the department, but we've also got Brianna Todd, who is the co-president of the Anthropology Society, and who has been for several years now really key to helping the department to get the resources that we need to put on events like this. So I'm going to turn it over to Bree for the last word.
Thank you, Andrew. So I just wanted to say on behalf of all the undergrad students in the Anthropology Society, thank you so much for coming. I know I really enjoyed this talk as somebody who has my own personal COVID garden taking over my apartment right now. It's gotten a little bit out of hand, but I love plants. So I definitely really enjoyed this talk. And I've had some of my friends who were in the talk texting me saying, that was really good. I'm so glad she should come back. So thank you so much. We really appreciated it.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and for making time.
Okay, well,